I'm Cristine Legare. I'm the director of the Cognition, Culture and Development Lab at the University of Texas at Austin in the Psychology Department. And my research program focuses on the interplay between our universal human mind and the variation in human culture. I think that studying how our minds facilitate the use of cultural tools, engagement in cultural innovation, and also membership in diverse cultural communities speaks to foundational questions about cognitive evolution. And my research program focuses on interdisciplinary research in the study of cognitive science. I integrate research from both theory and methods from cognitive and evolutionary anthropology, psychology, and philosophy. I do field work. My lab and I actually do field work in the United States, in Brazil, in China, in South Africa, and also in Vanuatu, which is in Melanesia. And we study causality from a cognitive, developmental, and cross-cultural perspective. So one of the lines of research focuses on how causal explanation develops, how we come to construct causal explanations for the worlds around us. I also study how we integrate proximate and ultimate explanations using both scientific explanations and supernatural or religious explanations. I study causal reasoning about ritual and also the cognitive developmental foundations of cultural learning. So in one ongoing line of research, I'm investigating from a cognitive psychological perspective how we integrate both natural and scientific or as well as supernatural and religious explanations across cultures and across development. So what we've done is to study what I call existentially arousing domains, such as death, our origins, biological origins, and illness. And in this line of research, we're looking at how people integrate what are often considered to be incompatible explanatory frameworks. And although scientific and religious explanations are often presented as incompatible, as irreconcilable, the research that we've done, the psychological research that we've done, has demonstrated that this just fundamentally is not the case. That psychologically, people have no problem integrating both scientific and religious explanations, and in fact do so in quite universal and very predictable ways. So we've discovered a number of explanatory frameworks that people use to integrate scientific and religious explanations. To give you one example, in the case of biological origins, people use something called theistic evolution. So rather than seeing scientific and religious explanations for origins as incompatible, they use them to explain multiple levels of causality. So the scientific explanation might explain more microbe-level evolution. So evolution provides the proximate explanation, where religion might provide the more distal explanation, which basically provides a functional account of God as the initiator of a long process of evolution. Another line of research that we've engaged in that I think is compelling, perhaps for a cognitive science of religion audience, is to examine ritual from a cognitive psychological perspective. So anthropologists, of course, have studied ritual for decades, many, many decades, and have a variety of different compelling theoretical accounts for how ritual is used, maybe the function of ritual in human groups. And the truth is, from a psychological perspective, we know pretty much nothing about this, and there's very little experimental evidence for how ritual is used. So one of the lines of research we are engaged in on this topic is the use of ritual for solving instrumental problems. So we've done research in Brazil on ritualistic remedies called simpachias, and what this research has demonstrated is that even for rituals that appear not to have any causal mechanism or there to be any real causal account that would link actions and outcomes, if you look at this in using very constrained experimental tasks, intuitive causal principles are at work. So we found that rituals that are more repetitious, that have a larger number of procedural steps, are perceived to be more causally efficacious. So what this research really demonstrates is that foundational psychological principles, specifically intuitive causal principles, influence how ritual efficacy is evaluated. We also have another line of research looking at how children integrate both imitation and innovation as dual engines for cultural learning. And one part of this line of research is looking at how we acquire cultural conventions like rituals and the function of ritual in the context of social groups and social interaction. So just as one example of this line of research, what we've done is to develop novel rituals that we've introduced into social groups, into children's social groups, and looked at the impact of engaging in rituals on social group cohesion, infusion, in-group preference, things like this. So we're using the empirical tools, the experimental tools of psychology to test anthropological theories in productive ways, and in early childhood, which is also something that has never been done before. Absolutely. So the reason I got interested in how scientific and religious explanations are reconciled and integrated was for really practical reasons. So for my master's thesis, I studied how children integrate witchcraft and biomedical explanations for AIDS. Actually, it wasn't just children, it was a developmental study. So I looked at young children in middle childhood, adolescents, and adults. And what I did was I used ethnography to construct vignettes using a priming technique to try to figure out how two explanatory frameworks, which on the surface seem to be quite incompatible, are integrated in this context. So in South Africa, HIV infection is as much of a problem as it's ever been. There are a number of practical reasons why people are trying to understand why appealing to witchcraft explanations persists, despite the fact that there are biomedical accounts what causes AIDS. And what this research uncovered is that people appeal to multiple levels of causality. So witchcraft often provided a more distal explanation, just like you would find in the case of origins that I mentioned before. A supernatural or religious explanation provides a proximate mechanism, and a natural or scientific explanation provides a distal mechanism. So, for example, when I would interview participants about the cause of AIDS or why a particular person got AIDS, participants would say things like, well, a witch put an HIV-positive woman in his path, or a witch made a condom weak and break. So these are explicitly acknowledging that the proximate explanation might well be the transmission of a virus, but the more distal explanation remains, right? Why did I in particular become infected with HIV? And this is the kind of broader point about what I call explanatory coexistence, that rather than viewing the integration of natural and supernatural explanations as something irrational, this to me speaks to our cognitive flexibility and also to our need for more personalized, multi-level explanations. We don't just want to know what causes illness at a mechanistic level. We want to know what causes illness for me personally, right? What I did to deserve bad things happening to me, right? There are multiple levels of explanations that we desire as a species, and people use both religion and science to provide explanations for multiple levels of causality. So my perspective on how to integrate field research and experimental research is to move in very fluid ways back and forth. And part of the way that I do that is the use of multiple and convergent methodologies. I think you have to be well versed in using more than one kind of method to do research that is culturally informed, that is ecologically valid, that is cross-cultural. The key is not just mastering multiple methods, but being versed in the theoretical perspectives of multiple disciplines. So to do the kind of work that I'm interested in, it's not sufficient to to have mastery in cognitive psychology, it's necessary to read about evolutionary anthropology, evolutionary psychology, to understand the developmental psychology literature, to know something about philosophy. It's not necessary to master the methods of all of those disciplines, but they provide unique windows into the kinds of questions that are exciting and interesting. I think from my perspective, all of the most interesting questions are interdisciplinary in nature and require converging methodologies. So from a practical perspective, what I often do is start with questions that are broad, that are of, I think, fundamental social scientific intrigue. Ritual is one really great example of this. And even though psychologists are new to understanding ritual, anthropologists have long noted that ritual is a pervasive feature of all human culture. And starting in anthropology made sense. There isn't a well-established literature in psychology to start from, or to start with. However, psychology has, cognitive psychology in particular, really rigorous and helpful and very constrained experimental methodology that can be brought to bear to test a lot of the anthropological theories that prior to this line of research, there really hasn't been a lot of consistent experimental evidence for. So starting with where the theory currently exists and where the methods exist, and then, crucially, finding a cultural context and finding a content area where you can merge the two. Right? You need to find concrete evidence for the theories you want to test, and that must be done in a way that is embedded in a particular cultural context. So you have to locate your question within a context before there's any hope of testing the theories that you want to test. And before there's any hope of doing comparative work. Right? You've got to start somewhere and master an understanding of that behavior, both psychologically and anthropologically, before you can move to another cultural site, which would be the next step.